From C.Handler's newest book, I'll Have What She's Having. Chapter 1, Little Girl. When I was a little girl, I spent large parts of my day dreaming about the kind of woman I'd one day be. I wanted to fast forward through all of my youth and misery and become the more glamorous, successful adult version of myself. She would be nothing less than fierce, this woman I'd become. She would never have to worry about fitting in. She wouldn't be the type of person who valued herself based on other people's opinions. She wasn't going to be someone who followed what others did. She would be a leader. She'd be someone who would never have to rely on another person for anything. She would be confident and never hesitate to stick her neck out for other people. Anyone who needed a hand would be able to depend on her. She'd be strong and she'd be beautiful, with a mind so sharp, no one could ever call her just a pretty face. She'd be so much more than that. She'd be able to light up a room, and her light would spread, making others feel brighter, better. She would be passionate and fiery and courageous. She'd never be afraid to tell the truth, no matter the consequences. She'll be different, this woman. She'll set an example for all other women. She'll soar through the world, traveling the globe, leaving her mark everywhere she went. She'll break some hearts and heal others. She'll have men at her feet begging to be with her, and women at her feet begging to be her friend. She'll cast a wide net and have friends all around the world. She'll have different loves throughout her life, and then maybe one true soulmate and everlasting love. Or maybe not. She'll be a beautiful hurricane. She'll be respected for many reasons. She'll love people passionately and save people's lives with her generosity. She'll be educated about global politics, read every book she can get her hands on, and speak multiple languages. She'll have certainty in her own opinion and the power to change others. She'll have the courage of her own convictions and the boldness to know she is capable of whatever lies at the heart of her dreams. She will be the baddest, the best kind of bad, a matriarch. This woman I'll become, she will never be silent. She'll be brave and strong and able to get out of any bad situation. She will have the kind of bravery it takes to walk into a situation knowing that the worst could happen, and she'll jump in anyway. The kind of bravery it takes to walk away from something or someone you love, knowing that you are walking away not in weakness but in strength. Knowing that you will survive because you are a survivor. She'll be a survivor. Why do I have to wait so long to get to be this woman, I'd wonder. Childhood has been such a waste of my time. And then on the other page, the final page, it says, when we are children, the essence of who we are is front and center. We are unscathed by what can very often be an ugly world. Bringing that child into adulthood, even only for moments at a time, is how we remain true to ourselves. Hold on to that child tightly as if she were your own, because she is. From C.Handler's I'll Have What She's Having. This little note between the first and second chapter. When we are children, the essence of who we are is front and center. We are unscathed by what can very often be an ugly world. Bringing that child into adulthood, even only for moments at a time, is how we remain true to ourselves. Hold on to that child tightly as if she were your own, because she is. Hard lemonade. At 10 years old, I decided to start my own lemonade business. I asked my sister Shauna if she would be interested in going into business with me. She was 5 years my senior, and she insisted that in order for her to come on board, this would need to be a joint venture. We'd have to split everything 50-50. I begrudgingly agreed, but I was firm in letting her know that I would be the one making most of the business decisions, and that in order to make some real money, we would be reimagining the lemonade stand business. Ours would be a hard lemonade stand serving gin, whiskey, and tequila. On our first day, we made $13, and after splitting it down the middle, I was left with $6.50. This was not going to work. I needed a greater profit margin and less overhead. The bottom line was that I would have to find cheaper labor. You're fired, I told Shauna as we walked down the dirt road back to our house with all of our lemonade equipment. She tried to explain to me that I wasn't in a position to fire her, but I reminded her that it was my idea in the first place and that she was welcome to start her own lemonade stand and become my competitor. The next day, I went door to door in our neighborhood looking for staff. I knocked on each door, announced that I was C.Handler, a 10-year-old business owner who was interested in hiring another child to work with, and if the employee insisted, I would allot a half hour of playtime after each shift. I was well aware that most children my age did not have the same work ethic I did. That's when I met Nelson, another 10-year-old who seemed eager for a playmate. I started grooming Nelson right away. I took him back to my house and demonstrated the right ratio of lemonade to alcohol. I explained that our target market was the parents, and that our ancillary market would be their children, and that we would be giving straight lemonade to anyone who looked younger than Nelson. On our first day in business together, Nelson and I made $33. When I handed him his commission, he couldn't believe his good fortune in meeting me. Stick with me, Nelson, I'll show you the way, I told him, tousling his hair and dropping him off at his house. By the end of our first week together, word had spread about our little lemonade bar, and business was booming. I made over $359 in that first week, and when I gave Nelson his commission of $3.59, he lost his marbles. This is more money than I would have made if I lost 5 teeth in the same week, he exclaimed. I didn't have the heart to explain that the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and the Easter Bunny were not real. This kid has a great work ethic. I thought he's enthusiastic about bartending. Better to keep him motivated and delusional if I want to earn a serious living. First class. My mother took me on my very first airplane ride across the country to visit my aunt and grandparents in Los Angeles when I was 10. There were 4 of us traveling, including my mother, and when we boarded the plane and walked past the first class section, I stopped and sniffed around. This seems like my group, I told my mother. Instead, she ushered me down the aisle toward the very long coach section and whispered that the section I was referring to was first class, and that we would never be flying first class because there were 5 kids in our family and we couldn't afford it. Speak for yourself, I thought. Once we got back from California, I was more motivated than ever to start earning some of my own cash. The writing was on the wall. If my family was content flying coach for the rest of their lives, we simply weren't on the same page, and I would at some point have to split ties with them. My parents had a house on Martha's Vineyard where we'd spend the summer months. That year when we arrived, I called every hotel in Edgerton and gave them my name and number in case any of their guests needed a babysitter. I was 10 at the time, but I looked like I was 15, so I lied and said I was 15. I ended up spending that summer babysitting for a 14-year-old boy. His name was Jeremy, and he had behavioral issues, which required me to regularly put him in timeouts. I babysat for Jeremy for the next 3 summers until he was 17 and I was 13. Thanks to my lemonade stand business and burgeoning babysitting empire, I had already saved thousands of dollars by the time I was 12. So, when my mom announced that we would be flying to California for my grandfather's funeral, I walked down the street to my friend's house. Her mother was a travel agent, and I gave her $3,000 to purchase a first-class ticket to Los Angeles for myself. When we boarded the plane, I was with my 2 brothers and my mom. I located the seat identified on my ticket, stuffed my Barbie backpack into the overhead bin, sat down in my assigned seat, 2C, and looked at my family. "I'll see you idiots at the end of the flight," I said. I looked around at the passengers in first class, many of whom were drinking champagne. These are my people, I thought. This is my group. This is where the woman I will become is going to sit. Cross-country chicanery. At 19, I decided it was time to move to Los Angeles and become a celebrity. I didn't know what exact vocation I would end up in, but I had strong opinions about a lot of things, and I thought the world would be a better place if I shared them. I had completed 1.5 semesters at a community college in Morristown, New Jersey, where I realized rather quickly that I'd be better off skipping college and moving to California. I was very inspired by Three's Company and their lifestyle on that show. I was eager to strap on a pair of rollerblades and stroll down the Strand, telling everyone, "Come and knock on my door." When I told my parents my plan, they said they thought it was a good idea. In my father's words, "Good, please go. I'll get one of the cars ready." Being that he was a used car dealer, he always had cars, but none of them were ever ready to actually drive. He hooked me up with an oil change and transmission check, and then bought me 4 new tires for my 1985 stick-shift silver Audi Quattro. I'd never seen my father as enthusiastic about spending money as he was paying for those new tires. That's how happy he was that I was moving 3,000 miles away. I dug that car until I drove its transmission straight into the ground. The night before I was set to drive across the country alone, my brother Glenn came over to the house and told me he had met a bartender who also happened to be heading across country and was looking for a ride. My brothers have never been overly protective of me, and this was a classic example of how little regard for my safety they had. "Sounds good, as long as he can afford to chip in for hotels and gas money," I told Glenn. The next night, I picked up a 25 or 26-year-old short blonde man from his parents' house somewhere in northern New Jersey. I can't remember this person's name, but one of the first sentences out of his mouth was, "Should we drive to Harlem first and get some cocaine for the ride?" I had experimented with cocaine before, but it wasn't a passion of mine at the time. I had zeroed a little interest in doing it while driving across country, but I was excited to go to Harlem with someone who knew their way around. Harlem had been off limits when I was a teenager, and when we went to the city in high school, it was mostly to a nightclub called the Limelight, where we dropped acid and ecstasy. Cocaine seemed like an older person's drug, but I liked this guy's spunk, so we headed off to Harlem. I sat in my car on 146th Street while he went inside a house for about 20 minutes and came out with a bag of cocaine the size of an airplane pillow. I had only seen bags of drugs that massive in the movies, and I was flabbergasted at the sheer volume. He reported that this was a pound of cocaine and that it would be his contribution to the trip. I told him that I didn't really do cocaine and that he would have to pitch in financially for lodging and gas, which I thought my brother had explained. He clarified that it wasn't a problem and that if I wanted the cash instead of the cocaine, we could easily sell some of it along the way. I envisioned myself driving across country while slowly transitioning into a coke dealer and then having to call my brother from behind bars upon my first arrest, probably in Texas. From Harlem, we drove down to Maryland and headed for Route 66, which takes you straight across the country to California. There was a long detour through Washington, D.C., and many lanes were shut down on the highway for repair. By this time, it was late at night, and my passenger, whom I'll refer to as Dipsy Doodle, had taken out several large maps, while also scooping cocaine out of the bag with his bank card and snorting it. I was confused by the panoply of maps. This was before cell phones and satellite navigation and all that, but how many maps of one country did a person need? There are 3 highways that take you across the United States, and it is a pretty straight shot, so this behavior was suspect. All I could think of was my brother Glenn and his lackluster ability to make choices that were in my best interest. Dipsy Doodle was talking a lot about all the different options we had to zigzag across the country and all the national parks we could hit up on our way. I didn't have the patience to explain that we weren't going to hit up any national parks and that I was trying to get to my aunt's house in Bel Air as soon as humanly possible, and that the only reason he was with me was so I wouldn't have to drive across the country as a single 19-year-old female. Seeing the condition he was in made it clear that if anyone would be taking care of anyone in this situation, it would be me taking care of him and not the other way around. By the time we got to Maryland, Dipsy Doodle hadn't stopped talking for 4 straight hours. I needed a break. I told him that we were going to have to pull over for the night at whatever Howard Johnson or Holiday Inn we found next. We checked into a room with 2 double beds where Dipsy Doodle proceeded to lay out his map collection all over the coffee table in bed, continuing to talk about all the sightseeing we could do. He was somehow under the impression that we were on a retirement trip of sorts, and that we had all the time in the world to explore every nook and cranny of America. At this point, I was lying in my bed, calculating how fast we could actually get to Los Angeles if we only stopped for gas. Dipsy Doodle hadn't even bothered to bring his suitcase into the hotel because he explained he'd be up all night doing cocaine and mapping out our drive. I fell asleep to the sound of him snorting cocaine off one of the maps, and when I woke up in the morning, he was pacing back and forth throughout the room, looking like Dog the Bounty Hunter. I don't know if Dog the Bounty Hunter does copious amounts of cocaine, but he sure looks like he does. I got up, brushed my teeth, might have taken a shower, and then told my driving partner that I was going to pack up the car and that I'd be right back. When I got to the parking lot where my car was, I opened the trunk, took his suitcase out, placed it in the parking space next to my car, and drove away. You didn't have to be a member of Mensa to realize this guy was going to be a massive liability. I hauled ass across country, avoiding all truck stops, and only stopped for gas until I got pulled over in Amarillo, Texas, on Route 66 by a state trooper. State troopers seem petrifying to me at 19 years old, and I was definitely scared. The trooper strode up to my driver's side window with a large black German shepherd, who proceeded to go apeshit when he got to the trunk area of my car, which was where Dipsy Doodle had stored the cocaine for an hour before we got to Maryland, when he became paranoid that cops were following us. The state trooper asked me to step out of my car after I handed him my license and registration, and then sternly directed me to take 50 steps behind the car. I stood on the side of Route 66 with 18-wheelers passing me, imagining a life behind bars, all before I even had the chance to make a name for myself in Hollywood. I devised my defense if the trooper in his very intimidating, wide-brimmed trooper's hat put me in handcuffs. I would insist that they dust my car for fingerprints in order to prove there had been another person in my car whom I had the good sense to leave in Maryland, and that they could test me for cocaine and realize I had nothing to do with the drug. My story would be that once I knew that Dipsy Doodle had cocaine on him, I kicked him out of the car. The fact that I drove him in my car to pick up the cocaine would be omitted from the tale. As another 18-wheeler blew past me standing on the side of the highway, I almost fell over at the intensity of the wind. After 20 minutes of a thorough examination of my car, the trooper informed me that I was free to go because they had not found anything incriminating, even though the dog's reaction suggested otherwise. I pulled back onto the highway with both legs shaking and didn't stop for anything other than gas for the rest of the trip. I arrived in California 17 hours later. When I reached my aunt and uncle's house in Los Angeles, I told them the whole story. My uncle responded by asking me to confirm that all the cocaine was indeed gone. I haven't done cocaine in ages, he said. I wouldn't mind a big fat line. That night I called my brother Glenn, who is now on Martha's Vineyard with my parents. I thanked him for setting me up with the complete basket case to drive across the country with, and told him that his judgment needed an update. In very Glenn-like fashion, he seemed nonplussed. Yes, he said, I heard your driving companion had to hire a taxi from Maryland back to Morris Plains, New Jersey. Good for him, I said. Our first order of business was going to Harlem so your friend could buy a pound of cocaine. I went on to tell Glenn about being pulled over in the panhandle of Texas, and that if I hadn't left my driving companion in Maryland, I'd be in a Texas state prison right now, getting finger blasted by a female prison guard. So thanks for that referral, I said, and hung up. No one was going to stop me from getting to LA and starting my life. When an obstacle arose in the form of Dipsy Doodle, I removed said obstacle. Temporary employment. The best way to describe my early years in Los Angeles would be to say I scraped by. I was either getting paid by focus groups, which meant sitting in a room with 20 strangers who were also getting paid $30 an hour to give our opinion on new products, or working with a temporary employment agency, which required me to pretend to be a secretary in various professional settings. This is not where any talent of mine lies. I couldn't even transfer calls from the main desk to different offices without getting screamed at. I was never invited back to any job twice, and at one law firm, one of the partners called the front desk to ask me who the blonde bimbo temping was, and when the hell we were going to get rid of her. I stammered. "I think you're talking to her." "I can just leave," I said, putting the phone down, grabbing my things, and hauling ass out the door. The timing couldn't have been more perfect because I'd been fantasizing about a chocolate frappuccino all morning, and there was a Starbucks on the bottom floor of the building. I didn't care that he called me stupid. I knew I wasn't stupid. I have been called stupid many times in my life. I've been called dumb, obnoxious, trashy, raunchy, crass, a fake, and various other things throughout my career. I have been all of those things at certain moments, but not one of those words encapsulates who I am. None of the things other people have called me has ever really mattered. What other people say about you only matters if you believe what they're saying is true. I knew that I didn't have the type of brain to work in an office or with any sort of technology. And this was before the advent of present-day technology and what we're dealing with today. When it comes to technology, having my hands tied behind my back and my head stuffed inside a watermelon would yield the same results as having full use of my eyes, ears, and fingers. At any moment, I am one JPEG away from stabbing myself in the vagina. Even in my early 20s, when I was broke, bouncing from one job to another, borrowing money from anyone I could, I knew I had value. I knew that if I kept chugging away, I would find the people who would recognize that value. I wasn't going to let some guy who worked in an office building, and would for the rest of his life, make me feel bad about not being able to transfer a phone call, just because he had a law degree. The inability to transfer a phone call only further cemented my suspicion that I wouldn't be good at anything that required me to sit inside an office. I took getting yelled at that day as a sign that I was headed in the right direction, that I needed to use my voice, and that temporary office work was one more thing I tried and could now cross off my list. This day lives in my memory because if this had happened on a different day, a week earlier or a week later, I would have had a different reaction. I would have felt shame at being called stupid, inadequate for not being able to transfer a phone call, and I would have allowed a stranger to make me feel terrible about myself. If this had happened on a different day, I would have walked out of that law office in tears. None of that happened because he caught me on a day when I felt good about myself, hopeful about the future, even though my life was anything but stable in that moment. I was my true self that day, and I was grounded in the idea that I would set out to do what I came out to California to do, to make a living at being me. In the grand scheme of things, this man didn't matter at all. He serves as a reminder to me on the days when I do not feel strong, confident, or hopeful to tap into the version of me who does. To know that every feeling passes and that no moment in time is permanent, and that the truest version of who we all are is confident, hopeful, and resilient. Montreal Comedy Bomb. After about 5 years of doing stand-up pretty regularly around Los Angeles and opening for other comics on the road, I was offered my very first spot at the Just for Laughs Montreal Comedy Festival. This festival was the industry standard for an up-and-coming comic, signaling that you were on your way to big things. It also meant that you would be seen by everyone in the industry who could hire you. Once I arrived in Montreal, it became clear through my manager at the time that there was a buzz about me and my showcase. Everyone would be there. It would be standing room only. And every person in the audience would be someone who could make a decision about putting me on television. I felt like everything I had come to Los Angeles for was about to come together, and that I finally would be recognized for my value in the industry. I wanted to blaze through. I was prepared because I had been practicing this 10-minute set for months, and I knew that it was going to be a very important night. I bombed badly, very badly. It was mortifying. I got on stage, my timing was off, my jokes fell flat, and it all fell apart at the seams. Upon realizing how quiet the room had become, I sped through the rest of my set and scurried off stage. I was too embarrassed to hang around afterward, and I was too humiliated to see the pity on the faces of all the people who had just watched me tank. My manager didn't know what to say because it was an embarrassment for him as well. He had spent the last 2 weeks inviting every industry person he knew to the show. Zach Galifianakis walked me to my hotel room that night. When we got to my room, he told me, "You're going to want to be alone for a while." This was at a time in my 20s when I needed other people to make me feel better when I was feeling bad. But there was no one who could do that. He was right. There was no one to call, and no one who was going to make me feel better. That night was one of the worst nights of my early adulthood. I sat in my room wondering what the hell I was going to do with my life. I had never felt so ashamed. How could I have blown such a big opportunity? How long would it take me to redeem myself? And how would that ever happen? How would that even happen? I didn't call anyone from my family, which I always did after a successful show. I sat alone, in shock, and cried like my life was ending before it had even begun. I had another show the next night, which went a lot better, but it didn't matter because no one from the industry came. My manager tried to round up some executives to give me another shot, but everyone had moved on to the next talent who had buzz around them. No one was interested in offering me a second chance, and I really couldn't blame them. The idea that so many people thought I was untalented made me physically ill. It was the first big professional failure of my career, and it hurt badly. When I got back to Los Angeles that Monday, my manager called and told me that Grace Wu from NBC hadn't been able to make the show in Montreal and was asking if I had any sets that week that she could see. Grace was the only top-level executive who hadn't been at my show in Montreal, and she wanted to see me perform. I called my friend Sam Brown and booked myself on a show for the very next night at a club called Luna Park. I crushed that show at Luna Park. I did the same exact set, and because I had nothing to lose, I was calm, secure, and my timing was on. The pressure was off, and I went up there and did my thing, and I did exactly what I had hoped to do at the festival 3 nights earlier. The next day, I got a call from my manager who told me NBC was making me an offer for a development deal for my own TV show, and I would be paid $100,000. When people say everything happens for a reason, I always think, what reason? Perhaps I needed a dose of humility. Perhaps it was a lesson in counting your chickens before they hatch. Who knows? What I do know is that at 25 years old, I had one of the worst sets and career lows of my life, and within 72 hours, everything had completely turned around. Suddenly, I was able to stop waitressing and start meeting with writers about my very own TV show. It took only 72 hours for every feeling I had in Montreal to be turned on its head and for the future to be bright again. I think of this moment often when things aren't going well or when a friend of mine is going through a tough time. So often we are ready to give up or throw in the towel when, right around the corner, there is a pocket of sunshine we hadn't known was headed straight for us. Even in my lowest moments, I keep my head geared toward the sky because I'm no longer in the business of missing rainbows. Everything can change in an instant, and more important, it doesn't matter how many people say no. All you need is one person to say yes. Jane Fonda. I got an email from Jane Fonda one day that said, "Hi Chelsea, it's Jane. I was wondering if you could come over to my house for dinner. I'd like to talk to you about a couple things." This sounded ominous. I had been friends with Jane for at least 10 years, and it seemed like sort of a terse email to get from her, but since Jane Fonda is a fucking legend, I didn't hesitate to respond with, "Of course, let me know when." "Tonight at 7. Jesus, I thought, this sounds like I'm in trouble. And I was exactly right. I was in trouble. When I got to Jane's house, her chef opened the door, walked me inside, and asked if I wanted something to drink. "No, thank you," I answered, thinking, if I'm about to be reprimanded, I want to be fully alert for my defense. Jane's demeanor seemed a bit cold, and I was anxious to find out exactly what I had done. As we sat for dinner and I was offered another drink that I declined, Jane asked me if I knew why she had asked me over for dinner. "No," I replied. "You may have noticed I was a little icy toward you when I saw you at Shonda Rhimes' fundraiser for Congressman John Lewis." The event she was talking about had been 3 months prior, and the truth was, I had noticed she was a little icy toward me, but I hadn't obsessed over it because at that point, I was bouncing through life with no direction or intention, and other people's feelings were not my problem. If I got a negative vibe from someone, I never overanalyzed it because I wasn't grounded and I didn't overthink anything. When I am grounded, I am as solid as a tree. When I'm not, I'm more like a leaf. I can say that now because I know what the difference is. You behaved badly at my party. From the moment you came in, you had a black cloud hanging over you and you insulted people, and it brought the whole party down. I don't know what drugs you were on, but a few people told me you were horrible to them. "I don't get it," she said. "Why did you even come if you were in that kind of mood?" Wow, I thought, this is a double foxy whoopsie doodle. Jane Fonda calling me out on my badly behaved self was as serious as it gets. This was definitely not the woman I dreamed of becoming. It was embarrassing, painful, and definitely cringeworthy, but I didn't let any of those things diminish the fact that Jane had taken the time out of her life to be honest with me. I needed someone to do that with me, and even in that moment of shame, I knew she would never have to speak to me about my behavior again because that's what that kind of honesty deserves. Action. I had just started going to therapy, so there was comfort in knowing I could bring this back to my therapist and have him help me digest and correct my behavior. But on a bigger note, Jane's admonishment made me understand and think about what it is I'm trying to put out into this world. Definitely not what I was doing at Jane's party. The truth of the matter was, who knows what drugs I was on? It could have been anything. It's my state of mind that determines my behavior on drugs. And if I'm in a good place in my life, and I'm grounded, drugs are fun, and so am I. If I'm in a bad state of mind, or in a bad time of my life, drugs will only make me defensive or angry, and that's when I bite. What struck me in that moment was Jane's brutal honesty. Something that has defined my entire career, but something I'd never been on the receiving side of. I promptly ordered a martini. We continued our dinner, and I told her that while this news was hard to hear, I had been in therapy for the past 2 months because I knew something was up with me and that I had in fact been dealing with the issue at hand, my deep anger. Good, she told me. Go find out what your problem is because your gifts are plentiful and sometimes people with the most gifts have the easiest time throwing them in the trash. Don't be a product of your environment, Chelsea. Make your environment be a product of you. This was the definition of sisterhood. Now what? 2 months before my dinner with Jane Fonda, I was giving an early morning speech in front of a few hundred people at a women's event in Los Angeles when my legs started to shake. I shifted my weight back and forth in an attempt to disguise what was happening, but then both of my legs started shaking, and then the shaking turned to trembling. My face got hot, and I felt moisture gathering in both armpits and at the back of my neck. I felt a panic set in that I hadn't experienced before. I looked to find a chair on the stage behind me and sat down for the rest of my speech. I had never had a panic attack before and was loath to admit that was what was happening. As I was walking out of the event after my speech, the organizer came up to me and asked if everything was okay. I had no explanation for what had happened, and I was mortified. Yeah, I'm just getting sick, I told her, avoiding eye contact. I had a slight fever this morning, but I didn't want to cancel, I lied, turning myself into a hero. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone thinking of me as anything less than the confident bulldozer I had become. I was not about to be associated with someone who was unsure of themselves. I made a living by literally standing up and speaking, and there was no way I was going to let this new anxiety send my career into a nosedive. A couple of months later, when I started my Netflix talk show, the leg shaking began happening each night when I would come out to do my monologue. After a few nights of this, I moved my monologue to the desk so that I could sit while reading it. I was terrified because something had shifted and nothing about my Netflix show or how I was feeling seemed right. Everything that had been working for me my whole life was suddenly not working for me anymore. I wasn't grounded, I wasn't confident, and I was second-guessing all of my decisions. I wasn't the person who I had been during my 7 years on Chelsea Lately, or who I had been during any of my Netflix documentary series just a year earlier. Something was different and it was unsettling. Felt like I was floating around, unsure of where to land, or if I even had the landing capabilities necessary to refocus. That woman I had dreamed of becoming hadn't even been on my mind in recent years. I had lost sight of her, and this great sense of unease had occupied my mind and had taken over. Something was bubbling up inside me, and when I tried to ignore it, the feeling only intensified. With my self-reliability threatened, I knew I had to get help. I hated the idea of therapy, but I hated this loss of confidence even more. I was hoping this would be a problem easily remedied over 3 or 4 one-hour sessions. Instead, I spent the next 2 years in psychotherapy twice a week. At the end of my 2-year stint with my therapist, Dan, I felt like a break was in order. If someone told me I had to go to another 2 years of therapy, or that I had to spend the next 2 years at Mar-a-Lago sharing a bed with Donald Trump, well, I would have chosen therapy, but you get my drift. I was eager to start applying what I had learned in therapy to my everyday life in a practical way without Dan. I had become so wrapped up in myself, and all of his therapy and self-discovery were not helping me disentangle that. Ironically, the act of pursuing a less absorbed perspective very directly conflicts with having to talk about yourself for hours ad infinitum. It is one big loop-de-loop of a no-fun zone. Therapy was exhausting in the sense that every new development or idea led to a period of intense self-awareness, followed by waves of acute self-consciousness coupled with endless self-recrimination. This was an overcorrection on my part, and I needed to stop looking outward and thinking about what people thought of me, or feeling shame at how many people I had offended over the years. I needed to pivot toward thinking about the type of person I wanted to be, rather than obsessing on the history of my behavior. Each day was a new discovery and a step closer to understanding awareness and energy and all the scientific things that aren't taken seriously enough by society because they aren't easily measured. I was beginning to feel the benefits of meditation, and when I was giving off good vibes, or when I was frustrated or depleted or giving off low vibes, Jane Fonda had gifted me with her honesty, and I wasn't going to let her down. A teacher friend of mine once described the school year as one of learning, and the summer as a time when you absorb what you learned. There are cycles of planting and cycles of harvesting. I liked this philosophy, and I applied it to therapy. There is a time for studying, followed by a time of absorption, followed by the time where you start applying all the new tools you've acquired to your life. I was still in that post-therapy fog of being able to name all of my behaviors and shortcomings that had led me to be so closed off to love and judgmental. But I was also confused as to how to move forward with my newfound repository of information. I had to blend my fresh awareness with the good parts of my old personality, while also dropping the behaviors and habits that were hurtful to me and to the people in my life. I once had a friend who came over because she was worried about her new haircut, and she knew I would tell her the truth. When she arrived, I confirmed to her that it was indeed the worst she had ever looked. My friend spent that day at my house crying, and after 3 hours, I lost my patience and reprimanded her for caring so much about her hair. It's going to grow back at some point, I scolded her. You can't be one of those people who is so consumed with the way you look. It's fucking hair. I said this to her as my eyes were swollen and covered in bruises from a CO2, carbon dioxide, laser, which prevented me from going out in public for the following 10 days. I knew my judgment of others could be harsh, and that I was always eager to share my opinions, whether helpful or hurtful. My new outlook allowed me to see how unnecessary it was to share every thought or harsh criticism. Therapy is a tricky endeavor. You can be interested in the subject and believe it is working, only to find yourself completely losing your shit over not being able to work the Sonos in your house. It's a lot of 2 steps forward, and just when you think you've graduated, you're taking 2 very large steps back in the direction you thought you were leaving. I kept auditioning new versions of myself to see which ones seemed like the best direction to head in. After discussing with Dan ad nauseum the idea that it wasn't my responsibility to be the life of the party or the most entertaining person at a dinner, I entered into what became a confusing time of course correcting. I found myself at more than one dinner party where I barely said a word. I had stopped inserting myself into other people's problems, and I was learning the power of keeping my opinions to myself. My friends became confused and slightly alarmed. "What's your story? You're not talking at all," my friend Jen asked me privately during a party at another friend's house. "It's not my responsibility to entertain everyone," I told her. "I need to listen instead of talk all the time." "So what, now you have a different personality?" she asked. "I don't know," I told her. "I don't know that you can change your personality. I'm trying to change my behavior." "Okay," she said, "but you're pretty boring tonight. How long is this self-reflection going to take? I mean, you've been in therapy for 2 years. We want Chelsea back." That was the problem. Some of my friends didn't want me to change at all, but I wasn't going to be the same old Chelsea. I wanted to grow and evolve into whatever the newer, better version of me was, while also taking the good parts of old Chelsea with me. It became a burden to have to explain to everyone what I was learning about myself and how I was experimenting with different behaviors, so I just stopped socializing so much, and I started hanging out alone. There was a woman I had to find.